Throughout history, technology would continue to affect the ways in which individuals would interact with text and words. Advancements in new technologies would allow for the remediation of text to develop and expand the newspaper's influence. The fact is that newspapers, in some form or another, have existed for centuries. Earlier examples include the Roman Acta and Chinese Tapao, both of which were types of news sheets. The modern newspaper is considered a European invention. In fact, newspapers would become commonplace by the 1660s, with two of the first being La Gazette in France and the Oxford Gazette in England. While newspapers would further help to transform print, early newspapers were born into a culture that was still very much oral. Ong would remind us that the goal of writing was still essentially to recycle knowledge back into an oral world. Newspapers themselves were possible through the introduction of the printing press. In Western culture, the printing press is largely associated with Johannes Gutenberg, who invented it in the 1450s. He utilized a process of mixing metals to cast individual letters into movable type. This technology would eventually allow publishers to print materials in quantities not previously possible. Such mechanized presses would allow the ability to create mass publication print, which ultimately broadened their audience base. The printing of news began as a way of transferring information of a single event written much later after it had occurred. The introduction of newspapers would allow written words to be read amongst a far greater audience. In essence, newspapers permitted communication to move beyond the transmission from one person to another. Thus, the newspaper would ultimately establish regular publication, whether that be daily, weekly, or monthly. In fact, early newspapers operated under the guise of reporting news or information as quickly as possible. This would be an important consideration, as the people would soon come to demand regular news as newspapers became more accessible. The introduction of the penny press in the 1830s would lead to a rampant rise of the newspaper in the United States. Benjamin Day, publisher of the New York Sun, introduced the first penny press newspaper. He had great success by focusing on circulation and the associated revenue brought in through advertising. Early newspapers were largely targeted towards businessmen and political parties. These papers typically cost 6 cents and spoke to the elite, with issues or concerns considered beyond those of typical lower-class citizens. On the other hand, the penny press introduced newspapers for 1 penny, making them more affordable and attainable for the masses. In fact, the low cost of these newspapers made them available to many new readers. As a result, publishers would soon begin targeting and appeal to these new readers, as they would write stories for the working class. The impact of the penny press was significant. For example, it brought about a series of changes, including the introduction of the news reporter, advertising income, and the introduction of the telegraph. Further, many of the structures that modern newspapers rely on today, including mass circulations, modes of distribution, and new technologies, were all developed because of the penny press's influence. The newspaper would help to alter society in a number of ways. As newspapers became more economical, it brought people together in a sense of national identity. Providing articles and information that was accessible beyond the elites no doubt brought more working-class people into the broader society. However, how did the popularity of the newspaper affect or advance literacy rates? The evidence is not clear, but it appears that literacy rates were already increasing during this time in America. For example, it is estimated that about 60% of New England men were literate in 1670, 85% by 1760, and 90% between 1787 and 1795. Thus, it is evident that literacy rates were already improving before the arrival of the penny press. Further evidence suggests that literacy rates would continue throughout the 1800s and 1900s. For instance, Emery, and Roberts assert that illiteracy declined from 20% to just over 10% between 1870 and 1900. While it may be difficult to link literacy rates to the growth of the newspaper, one may assume that newspapers, magazines, books, and other printed texts did see some benefits to an increasingly literate society. However, Barker contends that neither the high cost of newspapers nor the ability to read would prevent the population from discovering its contents. Schudson suggests that while literacy is indeed important, it was not the pivotal factor in the growth of newspaper circulation. He contends that a rise in literacy in the 18th and 19th centuries was more likely due to the fact that Americans were gaining more political and economic rights. On the other hand, Farrell and Cupido argue that the newspaper circulation was indeed assisted by improving education and literacy rates that were occurring during this time. Together, these would continue to influence society as an increasing number of literate citizens had easy access to information. The penny press also brought about a number of other changes as well, including alterations to style and format. Prior to the introduction of the penny press, the typography and design of newspapers was uniform and traditional. With the rise of the penny press, illustrations and pictures would become more commonplace. Changes continued over the next century. By the 1930s, the look and feel of typical newspapers tended to see larger fonts reminiscent of tabloids. The newspaper had become an important part of daily life for most men and women by the 1800s. Newspapers would increasingly become part of the political world as their influence and power would continue to grow. Over time, they would encourage more citizens to become involved in politics and protest against government actions. However, the role of government has played a significant role in the history of newspapers. Judson contends that newspapers inevitably progress under a series of 3 stages. The first stage highlights that newspapers are essentially a monopoly controlled by the government, then moving towards a system where political parties take control before finally becoming more independent. Early partisan newspapers saw political leaders working closely with editors to promote or push their ideals. Along with the rise of partisan politics, Nerone claims that commercialization was also a major factor in the rise of newspapers. As newspapers became more independent, the number who owned them began to decrease. In 1910, more than 2,000 newspapers were owned by either individuals or groups, neither of whom owned any other newspapers. That is in stark contrast to today, where the majority of news outlets have largely been consolidated under a select group of owners. Farrell and Cupido note that conglomerates held approximately 70% of the paid circulation in the U.S. by the end of the 20th century. As the newspaper has evolved, so has the ownership of them. There seems little doubt that we are in the declining era of the newspaper. It has continued to see its influence wane since the latter part of the 19th century. In fact, the readership of newspapers has been decreasing for decades. Stevens has suggested that the estimated number of people who had read a newspaper has dropped from 85% in 1946 to 55% in 1985. Other statistics support this claim. A 2008 poll indicated that 53% of respondents had read the newspaper within the previous day, while just a decade earlier, that number was 65%. Clearly, newspaper readership has been on a significant downward trend. In 1940, there was approximately 1 newspaper circulated in the U.S. for every 2 adults, while that number would raise to 1 in 3 just half a century later. With continued challenges from television, radio, and digital technologies, it is almost certain that numbers have continued to decline over the last 30 years. I suspect that Bolter would suggest that the remediation of news is at least partly to blame. So is this really the end of the newspaper's influence? In 2000, advertising revenue made up roughly 82% of revenue, while a number of newspapers, including the New York Times in 2009, would soon see its circulation revenue surpass its advertising revenue. With a readership that continues to decline, this cannot be a positive sign. Yet this is not to suggest that people have stopped reading the news. It simply means that the manner in which they consume it has changed. Many have turned to the internet for their information. As a result, newspapers have also turned online to maintain and extend their shrinking audience by capitalizing on its appeal and capabilities. The internet offers publishers the opportunity to provide additional services to its print subscribers while also finding new sources of advertisement revenues. Fang notes that online readers receive additional information to stories than those carried in print versions. Online content also offers the mixture of text, images, icons, and hypertext, all of which may broaden its visual appeal. Like many text technologies before it, it is evident that the newspaper will continue to adapt and evolve in order to maintain a presence and influence.